Welcome to Diary of a Nutritionist. I am Ababachi Tamiro, a registered dietitian and nutritionist. In this audio, we're taking a look at the science behind the food we eat and turning research into practical, everyday knowledge. Today's episode explores what a report on pesticide residues in our vegetables means for you, your family, and your health. This is Diary of a Nutritionist, brought to you by Daily Smoothie and Alicia Health.
Have you ever, grabbed a tomato from the fridge, run it under the cold tap for maybe 3 seconds, given it a quick rub with your thumb, and then just tossed it straight into a salad?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is the universal culinary ritual. We all do it.
Right. Be honest with yourself. And while you were standing there at the sink, did you ever stop and wonder if that incredibly brief splash of water actually achieves, anything mechanically?
Most of us secretly suspect it doesn't. We're essentially relying on friction and just hoping for the best.
Yeah, friction and hope. Are you genuinely decontaminating your food, or are you just giving a piece of produce a very brief, very cold shower out of sheer habit?
Spoiler alert, it's usually the cold shower.
Which brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to give you a shortcut to understanding the exact chemical layer sitting on your daily vegetables.
And much more importantly, we're going to walk you through how to actually dismantle it.
Exactly. So we are analyzing a landmark 2026 report published by the Kenya Organic Agriculture Network, or KOAN. And the structure of this research is, well, it's brilliant.
It really is, because it tackles the problem in 2 distinct phases. First, they did a massive baseline assessment of pesticide residues in major Kenyan vegetable markets.
Right, get in the lay of the land.
Yeah. And then they partnered with the University of Nairobi to engineer a controlled kitchen experiment, testing how standard household prep methods actually degrade those specific chemical residues.
The transition from, identifying the systemic agricultural failure to actually testing consumer-level mitigation, that's what makes this data so compelling.
It takes it from a depressing supply chain issue to something actionable for your own kitchen.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that 3-second tap water rinse probably isn't cutting it. But to figure out what we actually need to wash off, we first have to look at what is surviving the journey from the farm to the market stall.
Right, the baseline data.
Yeah, so the KOAN researchers gathered 45 samples of tomatoes, kale, spinach, and onions from major markets across Nairobi and Nakuru. And the baseline data they pulled from those samples shows that a staggering 77.8% had detectable pesticide residues.
Which firmly establishes that pesticide application is it's the absolute norm within the commercial vegetable supply chain.
It's not an isolated variable.
Exactly. When nearly 80% of your sample size registers a chemical footprint, you're looking at a systemic agricultural standard.
But the baseline detection is one thing. The compliance failure is what really stands out to me. 1 in 3 of these samples, so 33.3%, actively exceeded the European Union maximum residue limit.
Yeah, the EU MRL framework.
Mm-hmm.
It's universally referenced in these studies because it serves as the global gold standard for food safety regulation.
Right.
However, we have to look closely at what an MRL represents mechanically, because it is frequently misunderstood. It is not an immediate toxicity threshold.
So crossing the MRL doesn't mean you are holding a poisoned vegetable that will cause an acute medical emergency right there in your kitchen.
It does not, no. An MRL is a regulatory ceiling based entirely on good agricultural practices.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It measures the maximum concentration of a chemical that should theoretically remain on the crop if the farmer adhered strictly to the manufacturer's guidelines.
You mean regarding things like dosing, application frequency, and timing?
Precisely. Meaning an MRL violation is essentially a paper trail of agricultural misuse.
Wow. So it proves the farmer either applied an excessive volume of the chemical, applied it way too frequently, or just completely ignored the necessary waiting period before harvesting the crop.
And looking at the breakdown of the KOAN data, the absolute worst offender for this type of agricultural misuse was, unsurprisingly, the tomato.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tomatoes had the highest proportion of non-compliant samples across the board. The individual numbers on the tomato samples they're difficult to process.
They really are.
There was one specific sample sourced from Kajiado County that tested positive for chlorphenapyr, which is a miticide utilized to control spider mites.
Right.
This single tomato carried chlorphenapyr levels at 19 times the European Union limit. 19 times.
It's a massive number.
When you see a multiplier that high, you have to wonder if we are dealing with a biological anomaly. Like, does the cellular structure of a tomato just naturally act as a chemical sponge?
What's fascinating here is that the biology of the tomato isn't the primary driver there. It comes down to the brutal economic realities of cultivating them.
Really? Economics over biology.
Yeah, because tomatoes are exceptionally vulnerable crops. Under current conventional farming practices, pests and biological diseases still claim about 34.4% of the global yield.
Okay, so a third of the crop is just gone, even with chemicals.
Yeah.
And if a farmer attempts to grow them without utilizing any crop protection chemistry,
They face up to a 77.7% loss. They would lose more than 3/4 of their total harvest.
oh, wow, that's devastating.
It is. So you have to combine that intense biological vulnerability with the macroeconomic reality of the market. There is a massive, inelastic, year-round demand for flawless tomatoes.
Right, everyone wants perfect tomatoes in December.
Exactly. So when a farmer spots a spider mite infestation spreading through a greenhouse and they know the market is paying a premium that week, the financial pressure is immense.
I can imagine.
This scenario leads directly to the systemic violation of the pre-harvest interval.
Just to clarify for everyone, the pre-harvest interval is the mandatory waiting period between the final chemical spray and the moment the crop is physically picked.
Right. It exists specifically to give ambient environmental factors like UV light, rain, and heat enough time to naturally degrade the pesticide molecules before human consumption.
But the farmers are skipping it.
When market demand peaks, farmers are heavily incentivized to spray the crop to protect their yield, harvest it the very next morning, and ship it immediately.
That is wild. So that truncated timeline, completely ignoring the natural degradation window, is the exact mechanism that results in a tomato reaching the market at 19 times the legal limit.
The economics force the chemical onto the plant, and the systemic pressure overrides the safety protocols.
So the chemical gets sprayed. But the KOAN study also highlights how the physical architecture of the vegetable itself determines whether that chemical actually stays there.
Yes, the shape and texture matter a lot.
If we look at the leafy greens in the data set, like kale and spinach, they ranked as the second and third most contaminated vegetables, respectively.
Which requires us to analyze the microstructure of leafy greens. Leafy vegetables present a massive surface area relative to their total biomass.
Lots of leaves, lots of surface to spray.
But surface area alone doesn't entirely explain the retention rates. We have to examine the physical texture and the chemical profile of the leaf itself. Kale has a highly complex crinkle topography.
It's essentially a landscape of ridges and microvalleys where aerosolized liquids can easily pool and settle.
Exactly. And furthermore, the surface of that leaf is coated in a natural, waxy cuticle.
Like a built-in armor.
Botanically, this cuticle serves to prevent cellular water loss and protects the plant from pathogens. But chemically, this wax is lipid-based.
Meaning it's fat-based.
Right. And modern pesticide formulations are highly sophisticated. They are routinely engineered with specific adjuvants and surfactants designed to bind directly to plant lipids.
Wait, so the agrochemical engineers are designing the pesticide to adhere to the exact biological compound that makes up the exterior armor of a kale leaf.
They are. It's a chemical lock and key designed to withstand environmental weather. You don't want your expensive pesticide washing off in the first rainstorm.
So the kale leaf is essentially optimized, both physically through its topography and chemically through its lipid profile, to trap and hold aerosolized sprays. It is remarkably efficient at retaining contamination.
It is a botanical trap, which provides a stark biological contrast to the bulb onion.
I was just going to bring up the onion. The onion samples in the KON study had 0 instances of exceeding the EU MRLs, not a single one.
It's a completely different physical profile.
If kale is a botanical trap, the onion operates entirely differently. It's basically a fortress. It grows entirely underground, acting as a subterranean bunker. The topsoil provides a dense physical barrier against overhead agricultural sprays.
The ambient aerosol dispersion simply cannot penetrate the topsoil layer to reach the edible bulb in any meaningful concentration.
And even beyond the soil barrier, the harvesting and culinary preparation process of a bulb onion inherently involves stripping away the outermost layers anyway.
Right. You are physically discarding whatever trace contaminants might have managed to bypass the soil. The anatomy of the plant dictates the chemical exposure to the consumer.
Okay, so we've established the mechanisms of contamination and retention, but we really need to address the actual biological risks to the human body. So what does this all mean for us?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the toxicity classifications. The study isolated 8 specific pesticide active ingredients that exceeded the regulatory thresholds.
And the World Health Organization classifies 7 of them as Class 2, right? Meaning moderately hazardous.
Yes, we are looking at specific active ingredients like chlorpyrifos, which is an insecticide, and difenoconazole, a fungicide.
Those names sound pretty intimidating.
They do, but the conversation around these chemicals often gets derailed by acute toxicity concerns. People naturally worry about experiencing an immediate, severe medical reaction from eating one unwashed salad.
Like getting violently ill that same night.
Right, but that is a statistical improbability with the residue levels we are discussing. The actual clinical concern is cumulative dietary exposure over a lifetime.
Bioaccumulation. Ingesting these compounds in microdoses every single day for decades.
Exactly. The long-term epidemiological data on repeated dietary exposure to Class 2 pesticides points towards systemic biological disruption.
What kind of disruption are we talking about?
We see documented correlations with neurodevelopmental issues, particularly regarding synaptic function and neural pathways in developing brains.
That's terrifying.
There is also a significant concern regarding endocrine disruption.
Meaning the chemical structures of these pesticides actually mimic human hormones. They bind to our cellular receptors and throw off the body's internal regulatory systems.
Yes, they can upregulate or downregulate natural hormone production. And that cascades into complex metabolic, developmental, and reproductive issues.
So it's not a stomach ache, it's your baseline biology being altered over time.
And the risk matrix heavily impacts vulnerable demographics, specifically pregnant women, developing infants, and the elderly.
And the macro scale of this exposure is rapidly expanding too. The KOAN report highlights that the total volume of imported pesticide control products into Kenya jumped from 14,600 tons in 2015 to nearly 20,000 metric tons by the end of 2020.
That is a massive injection of active, hazardous chemistry into the agricultural ecosystem in just a 5-year window.
Wait, let's look at this pragmatically. If the macroeconomic incentives drive farmers to aggressively over-apply chemicals, and the import volume of these hazardous products is climbing by thousands of tons, I mean, a consumer looking at a tomato on their cutting board seems entirely outmatched by the supply chain.
It feels like a losing battle.
Are we just supposed to accept a certain baseline of neurological and endocrine risk every time we bring groceries into our homes? Are we just completely helpless here?
That sense of fatalism is incredibly common when looking at systemic agricultural data, but it ignores the mechanical realities of chemical bonds.
Okay, I like where this is going.
The second phase of the KOAN report actively dismantles that helpless narrative.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The University of Nairobi researchers engineered a highly controlled kitchen laboratory specifically to test if consumer-level intervention actually works against these compounds.
The methodology they use here is fascinating.
Yeah, they sourced completely uncontaminated, clean batches of tomatoes, kale, spinach, and onions. Then, they intentionally spec'd them with a cocktail of the 7 highly hazardous pesticides found in the baseline market study.
They essentially created a controlled, worst-case scenario vegetable in a lab environment.
Right, because they needed to establish a uniform, high-concentration baseline to accurately measure the degradation rates of different mitigation strategies.
And then they tested 8 common, low-cost household preparation methods, things you can do at home.
Like washing under running tap water, blanching, soaking in salt, soaking in baking soda, soaking in vinegar, and standard cooking.
To empirically validate the reduction, they utilized advanced liquid and gas chromatography.
Not just eyeball testing?
No, measuring the exact molecular reduction down to a limit of quantitation of 0.01 milligrams per kilogram.
That is incredibly precise.
The chromatography allows us to move past visual estimation and analyze the actual molecular weight of the residue remaining on the plant tissue.
How does that actually work in the lab?
Well, gas chromatography vaporizes the blended vegetable sample and pushes it through a microscopic column. Different molecular compounds travel through that column at varying speeds, allowing the mass spectrometer to identify and count the exact number of pesticide molecules that survive the kitchen preparation.
Okay, so they are proving the molecular reduction at a microscopic level, which frames the act of vegetable preparation in a completely different light. Washing produce is no longer just a mechanical process of rinsing off topsoil.
No, it is a deliberate chemical extraction process.
Think of it like doing laundry. If you get a heavy industrial grease stain on a fabric, you know that just running it under a cold tap won't break the lipid bonds of the grease.
Water alone won't do it.
Right. You have to introduce a specific chemical solvent to alter the environment and lift the compound away from the fibers.
The agricultural pesticides are specifically engineered to resist ambient environmental water, just like we talked about with the kale.
So to remove them, you have to actively alter the chemical environment.
Yes, by manipulating the pH or introducing thermal shock to break the specific molecular bonds of that agrochemical formulation.
Let's break down the empirical data from the University of Nairobi and provide you, the listener, with the optimal chemical extraction process, the ultimate cheat sheet for each vegetable, starting with our subterranean bunker, the onion.
The chromatography data confirms that onions require the least chemical intervention.
Because of the fortress effect.
Exactly. The most effective protocol is purely mechanical and thermal, peeling the outer layers, washing under running tap water, and blanching.
The combination of physically stripping the exterior barrier and introducing a brief thermal shock nearly eliminates all trace residues.
But tomatoes require a distinct shift in strategy. The optimal method for the chemical sponge was a baseline wash, followed by a soak in a 2% baking soda solution, and finally cooking.
Baking soda.
Okay.
Moving to the leafy greens, spinach favored a mechanical and thermal approach closely mirroring the onion, actually.
Yeah, a thorough wash under running water, blanching, and then cooking yielded the highest degradation of the active pesticide ingredients for spinach.
But kale, our botanical pesticide trap with the waxy lipid cuticle, requires a heavy acidic intervention.
The optimal reduction was achieved by a wash, a prolonged soak in a 20% vinegar solution, and then cooking.
Wait, we need to pause and look at the culinary reality of this solution. A 20% vinegar soak is an incredibly aggressive acidic environment.
It's strong, yes.
If you submerge a thin, delicate leaf in an acid bath of that concentration, aren't you fundamentally degrading the cellular wall of the food before you even plate it? You're essentially quick pickling the kale and destroying the organoleptic properties.
You're definitely altering the texture.
So why does kale require such a hostile acidic environment compared to the tomato, which simply needs a mild baking soda soak?
This raises an important question about the chemistry here. The aggression of the required solution is dictated directly by the lipid cuticle of the kale we discussed earlier. Right. The acidic environment provided by the vinegar is chemically necessary to penetrate and break down that dense, waxy layer, which is actively shielding the pesticide molecules.
Ah, so you have to burn through the wax to get to the poison.
In a manner of speaking, yes.
Yeah.
In contrast, the tomato has a smooth, non-porous skin without that specific lipid barrier. The baking soda soak creates a highly alkaline environment, which triggers a specific chemical reaction known as hydrolysis.
Hydrolysis being the process where water molecules actively force their way into the chemical bonds of a compound, right?
Exactly. The alkaline pH weakens the ester bonds within the pesticide molecule itself, allowing the water to snap the structure apart.
That is brilliant.
Once the molecule is fractured through hydrolysis, it loses its adhesive properties and simply washes away. The acid in the vinegar is required to break down the leaf's biological defenses, while the alkaline baking soda is utilized to break down the pesticide's structural integrity.
So you are literally playing chemist at your kitchen sink, deploying targeted acids and bases depending entirely on the biological armor of the vegetable you are preparing.
You are. However, the University of Nairobi data includes a vital caveat that we must address.
What's that?
These targeted chemical interventions are highly effective, often reducing molecular residues by over 90%, but they are strictly a mitigation strategy, not a cure.
Meaning household chemical extraction cannot completely erase the original sin of severe pesticide misuse at the agricultural level.
No. If a farmer ignores the pre-harvest interval and a tomato hits your kitchen counter carrying 19 times the legal limit of chlorphenapyr, a 2% alkaline soak is going to reduce the chemical load significantly, but it still isn't going to return that tomato to a pristine baseline of 0.
It mathematically cannot eliminate a load of that magnitude entirely.
Exactly. The kitchen interventions must complement good agricultural practices at the farm level. They are not a replacement for systemic regulatory compliance and proper farming economics.
We started this deep dive looking at the standard 3-second tap water rinse, questioning if it accomplishes anything mechanically.
And we found out it doesn't do much.
Right. The data from the KOAN report makes it unequivocally clear that our commercial produce supply, driven by intense macroeconomic pressures and biological vulnerabilities, is carrying a significant load of Class 2 hazardous chemistry.
But the University of Nairobi chromatography data proves that you are not helpless.
Yeah, by deploying targeted pH interventions, utilizing baking soda for smooth skins to trigger hydrolysis, and vinegar for waxy cuticles to penetrate lipid barriers, you can dismantle the majority of those molecular bonds.
It places a massive amount of agency back into your hands.
It really does. Utilizing basic, affordable pantry staples to systematically alter the chemical environment of your food. It is an incredibly empowering set of data for anyone who cooks.
It changes how you look at dinner.
But it also leaves us with a much larger, somewhat uncomfortable philosophical question to consider as we wrap up today. Yeah. We now possess the empirical data to build highly effective chemical decontamination protocols right next to our cutting boards.
It's true.
But at what point does optimizing our household extraction methods inadvertently normalize a profoundly broken global food system?
That is a very valid point.
If we become highly proficient experts at stripping hazardous endocrine disruptors off our kale using calculated acid baths, are we simply internalizing the cost of agricultural failure so the commercial supply chain never actually has to change?
Are we just adapting to a toxic baseline?
Exactly. Are we just scrubbing the chemicals off ourselves to maintain the status quo? It's something to seriously evaluate the next time you are standing in the sink, mixing an alkaline solution for your tomatoes.
It definitely gives you something to think about while you wash your veggies.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to apply the baking soda and vinegar extraction methods to your next meal and take control of your kitchen chemistry. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diary of a Nutritionist. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you? What questions do you have? Leave a comment, send us a message, or let us know what you'd like us to unpack next. Until next time, keep learning, keep nourishing your body, and remember, small choices made consistently create health.